so much for your patience. I'm hopeful that the audio and the desktop are presenting now. Again, thank you to Staci Pomeroy with the Department of Environmental Conservation Rivers Program. She's a river scientist and is going to be presenting on phosphorus reduction from rivers as part of the implementation of the Phase 1 plan for the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL. So because we're late, we're going to go ahead and get started right away. And I just asked if any of the online folks could let me know via IM if they're having any technical difficulties. And then also if you have any questions, if you could go ahead and ask them by instant message, that would be helpful. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Staci.
Great, thank you, Bethany. Bethany kind of summed up the whole presentation in a short overview. So I'll kind of provide some background for the Rivers program and how we're looking at our TMDL and flood resiliency goals. Our program comprises of 3 sections: our Streamflow program, our river management, our stream engineers, and our river corridor and floodplain protection group. And all of us work to implement strategies and projects that help achieve the goals of the TMDL and flood resiliency. So we'll look at those in more detail. In the last 7 years, there's been 4 separate legislation acts that have focused on streams and floodplain functions, really with the goals to achieve water quality and flood resiliency in Vermont. And these laws really help us set up our management objectives of looking at stream equilibrium and corridor protection as key ways to achieve these goals. Protecting our floodplains and stream equilibrium can achieve multiple objectives, everything from our public and private property protection, our habitat and ecological integrity, as well as our water quality and quantity objectives. But what does really stream equilibrium and floodplain protection look like? So I'm going to introduce you to some of the components of stream equilibrium, and that will really help us understand how our programs meet these goals. Rivers move water, sediment, and debris, and there is a balance between the power that the stream has to move those and the resistance of the system in order to store those sediment and debris and water in the system. We also look at the shape of the river, its planform, its slope, its cross-section, and this is really important. You're going to see the little equation down there, Q equals VA. This is discharge equals velocity times area. It's really important when we look at the shape of the river to understand that when we tinker with it, we tinker with that equation. So if we change our width and depth, we change the area of the stream will respond by changing its velocity to meet that same discharge. If we change our slope and increase our velocity, the stream will respond by trying to adjust either its area or the discharge that's coming through that area will change. So it's really important for us to understand the shape of the river and how our work with it affects that equation. Streams store and transport sediment across the system, different gradations of sediment sizes and types. We need to understand where in the system there are natural streams that transport sediment and those areas that we expect sediment to be stored, and account for how that works in our system. The valleys that the stream moves through also play an important role in how our streams function and the shapes that they take on and their ability to store or transport sediment. So if we change a stream's valley type because of encroachment, such as roads or houses, from something that's very broad to very narrow, it would affect how it's able to store water and sediment in that area. It also changes that discharge equation. The floodplain connections are very important. both our vertical and our lateral connection to our floodplain. How do we store water? That vertical connection where water can get up and spread out across, but also how our streams move over time. That connection for their ability to adjust across the floodplains is very important. Because a stable stream is not a static stream. It will move over time, but oftentimes we try to stop that adjustment process. So we need to really account for the ability for streams to move over time, and if we stop the adjustment in one process, recognize that that adjustment process may move to another part of the system. So we need to account for that. When we look at our channels, there's a response when we adjust any of those components that make up the stream's equilibrium. One aspect that's been looked at is the Shum's channel evolution model. And really what this helps us understand is for many streams in Vermont, this is an appropriate type of, this is the type of response we see in our system. We've had floodplain connection in the past. For various reasons, that floodplain connection was disconnected, and the stream now has more water in it. It's holding more water. So it begins to adjust to accommodate for that extra water it has in its channel. This is often seen through widening and bank failures. If we allow the channel to kind of work through this process over time, it would create a new floodplain at a lower elevation. And these changes can be caused both from natural changes such as our floods and changes in our climate, as well as human-caused changes such as encroachment or channel management practices. But the channel will respond when we work to change any of those components that make up the stream's equilibrium. We've been collecting data in Vermont since around 2000, 2001. We've had our assessments, and we can look at how close do our streams meet these equilibrium conditions. We see about 70%, 70+% of our streams are not able to fully achieve this equilibrium condition, and they're going through some level of channel adjustment. So as we look at meeting the TMDL goals, it's important to understand where our streams are in this adjustment process so that we can recognize where we need to make projects and how we can accommodate the adjustment process as part of that. All aspects of our program work towards meeting flood resiliency and TMDL goals. About 22% of the lake's loading comes from stream bank erosion for phosphorus and sediment. And so how do we look at addressing that across our program in order to achieve the goals of reducing that load to the lake? Part of it is just understanding our streams. So looking at streams in Vermont, we use our stream geomorphic assessment data. We collect information, both remote sensing information as well as on-the-ground field information. This information is then developed into a corridor plan that helps explain what that information is, provide background and understanding of the conditions of the stream. From there, it also helps us identify potential projects and strategies. And then we move forward with partners in order to implement, develop and implement those projects. I'm going to provide a few examples of the data that we collect and also some of the projects that have been developed from that information. This is an example from the Browns River. As we look at the TMDL goals, we are using three primary components of the data that we collect to really understand where the stream is in its equilibrium condition. Looking at the incision ratio, so understanding that connection to the floodplain. How connected or not connected is our river to those floodplains? In the Browns River, about 70% of our streams do not have the full floodplain connection that they had historically. We look at that channel evolution process. Where are they in the adjustment process? Again, about 70% are going through an adjustment process, and that makes sense given we understand that many of the streams are no longer connected to their floodplain. So they're holding more water in their system as they're working during a flood event. We also look at the stream sediment regime. So how well is it storing or transporting the sediment in the system? This is an example of the sediment regime and why we look at this. This is an example from the Dog River. On our left is the reference sediment regime we might expect in this watershed. And the green really shows those streams that we would expect to both store sediment and in the channel and on the floodplain, as well as transport some. It's a kind of equal in, equal out system. The blue are transport streams, so narrower valley, typically a little steeper slope. We're not expecting large floodplain areas, or we're not expecting large amounts of sediment to be stored in those sections. If we look on the right, we can see that the sediment regimes have changed in many of the reaches. So our streams that were green and now are red are streams that are now contributing additional sediment to the system because they're no longer storing it on their floodplains. There are also ones that are now providing potentially more sediment to the system than they were historically. So as we look at projects in the watershed and think about our TMDL, we really want to help understand where in the system can we move those stream reaches back to their reference sediment regime. How can we make sure they're able to produce less sediment and be able to store sediment instead of just transporting it?
Okay.
Please.
So when it says reference sediment regime, is that all GIS based, like just based on slope and soil type?
Yes. Watershed size, stream type, valley setting, slope setting. Yes. Yeah.
So not including any built environment.
Not including any built environment. And so the existing sediment regime helps us look at now with the built environment and our changes in the watershed, how well are those streams meeting that reference condition.
Even if there's been a road or something for 100 years, that wouldn't be included in the...
Right. So what we would, you transition me to the next slide. So understanding that built environment, and that comes into play really understanding our valley type changes. So the existing will help us understand if we didn't, the reference would help us understand if we didn't have any of this built environment, this would be what we would expect. Existing shows us what we have. Then we can kind of look at where do we have opportunity to potentially move that back towards the reference condition. And this valley type plays a large role in where we may have opportunity. This is an example from the Dog River data. When we looked at the valleys where we had stream assessment, about 38% of those valleys had a change in confinement. And about just under 9% of those valley types went from that very broad, unconfined valley to a confined valley. So we may not be able to achieve full equilibrium or full reference sediment regime in some of those reaches because we don't have the room that we used to. So this helps us also understand where we may or may not be able to achieve full equilibrium given some of the built environment that we have now.
So that's the unconfined to confined.
Yes.
Like, downtown or something.
How we now have downtown. Yes. So I'm gonna. What we'll do is understanding that information. So understanding where our streams are, how connected they are to the floodplain. What is our valley type settings where we may be able to achieve those conditions? We start looking at restoration projects. A large part of our project identification and development is trying to make sure we recognize those stream processes as part of that restoration project. This is the Trout River. This is actually the first restoration project I ever got an opportunity to be involved in, 1999-2000 with my client. This was an active and passive restoration project. We actively did natural channel design. We had attempted to have the channel go through this large bend. The channel decided that that was not where it wanted to go. It broke through the channel block here and came through this area. We rebuilt the channel block. The stream still chose to go through there. One of the largest benefits that our program really recognized from this project was the importance of protecting that river corridor, because it allowed that process to play out. And while we attempted to engineer a channel in this location, the channel had its own objectives, its own of where it wanted to be. So we had provided for that space to occur. So this project really was a great example of you can do restoration through active work, but in accommodating that, you really need to make sure that you provide the room for the long-term channel adjustments that may occur, because the river will not necessarily stay where you attempt to put it. Kind of looking back at the Browns River and the Dog River, I'll provide you a couple examples of how we're addressing some of those changes that we've seen in those watersheds. One component of our program is our easement program. This is where we work with landowners and partners to protect the corridor in perpetuity. This project on the Browns River is just upstream from Silly Hill Dam, so there is a lot of sediment that ends up being stored in this area. It's just downstream from a long section that was historically straightened due to the rail bed, so that has changed from a sediment storage reach to a sediment transport reach. And this location now has additional sediment because of both the dam and the upstream sediment being transported to it. We worked with the farmer to create an easement with the Vermont River Conservancy to allow for that adjustment to happen over time. You can see the historic meanders out across the river area. We're actually now working with the upstream landowner to protect this portion of the river as well. We've worked in our program over the last several years. We have about 70 easements so far that are closed, with several more that are in the works. About 1,500 plus acres have been protected to allow that channel adjustment to occur, and we have about 40 stream miles that are no longer going to be managed. So these programs really help provide for a passive type of restoration, where we can allow channel adjustments to occur. We can reduce conflicts in channel management needs of landowners where it's very difficult to do that work, and improved water quality benefits by both that connection to the floodplain, but also these areas have a 50-foot buffer component to them, so we improve wildlife habitat and all those aspects of it. So a nice way of working in the watershed to accommodate that channel adjustment. We also work with partners and communities to do active restoration components. This is an example from the Dog River. This is one of those locations where we had gone from an unconfined valley to a confined valley. The community had built up around the stream. And because of that, there was a portion of the community that was flooded during Tropical Storm Irene. After the event, many of the homeowners in the community worked with FEMA to do buyouts, and this provided an opportunity in the community that hadn't been there before. So a large section along the stream was now had encroachments removed and could be potentially available for doing a remediation and restoration project. The town looked at this area and decided that they would like to use it for a community park. And as part of that, they also wanted to look at what was the opportunity for flood storage, as well as the recreational opportunities as part of that park. They've worked with funding from Clean and Clear, not Clean and Clear anymore, we're in the
Ecosystem Restoration.
Thank you. To look at projects to do floodplain restoration in those areas where there was homes removed, as well as areas that had historically been bermed. And part of this objective was to help that flood storage and water quality, but also to make sure that you're giving a little more room for the river to spread out in the valley setting. What they found as they're implementing this project was that they could see a large reduction in flood waters heights if with this project implemented, about 1.4 feet in a 10-year event. So it's significant in this area. You can really see changes in valley confinement and floodplain availability can have a significant impact on flood resiliency and water quality benefits. The last project I'll show you is just from the Black Creek Lamoille Valley Railbed project, and this is really to help us understand how these projects can significantly contribute to the reduction of phosphorus and sediment in our TMDL projects. So this is an area where historically the rail bed had been built up. You can see the old oxbow in the upper left-hand picture. We worked with the landowners, the community, VAST and VTrans, to develop the project. The rail beds were lowered and reconnecting floodplain in these areas. So it was a significant change to the floodplain in this location. As part of that study, we worked with the consultant to go back and sample those areas. Out of the 10 areas and 200 acres of floodplain that we reconnected, we looked at 3 locations to do sediment and phosphorus sampling. What we found from an event was that on those 3 floodplains, we captured about 950 cubic yards of sediment and about a ton of phosphorus. So just out of the 3 out of the 10, we had a pretty significant reduction or contribution of storing sediment phosphorus. So our program looks at passive and active projects as really a way to contribute towards our goals of TMDL reduction. The other components of our program are more regulatory and technical assistance. And so these programs, sections of our program, provide important resources to meet those goals, but not often how we would picture them as specific projects. So I'll explain how we look at those. So our river corridor and floodplain management program is made up of a large mix of things that we do, everything from corridor planning to flood smart web pages to working with communities after the flood, before the flood, state permits, so a whole mix of things that we touch on as part of this section of our program. A couple of the key strategies in our program is the avoidance strategy, and really we're trying to make sure that where we are able to, we reduce the potential of further encroachments. We want to minimize costs and damage during floods, but we also want to make sure we have restoration potential. So the more that we avoid further encroaching into our streams, the more opportunity that we have. Another key component is our no adverse impact standard. And this is really important because it will help us look at making sure there's no change in our elevation or our velocities in those floodway areas that really defined location. This is our floodways, more detail and where we know there's flooding, and our flood fringes, that 100-year floodplain, that we don't lose the storage volume in those locations. This is important because when we do encroach into those areas, it's been demonstrated there will be a changes in flood heights as you further develop a watershed, but also changes in the flood areas as you continue to urbanize or change the floodplain. So our no adverse impact really helps make sure that if you're putting a building in one location, we're not affecting somebody else or changing the location that those floodwaters may be. We also look at the no adverse impacts in our river corridors, making sure that we don't increase our erosion hazards, and trying to make sure that when we have future an investment in a location, that we're not setting ourselves up that we'll have to do future channel management. This is really important because oftentimes channel management areas, we're trying to protect one thing and we're transferring our issue to another location. So we want to make sure that as communities develop, we're not transferring an issue from one spot to another location. Our no adverse impact standard is used in our floodplain rules. So things that are not municipally regulated, such as our state-owned buildings, our Act 2, our power transmissions, our public service board, ag practices, forestry practices. So those permits for those things that are not municipally regulated will need to look at meeting that no adverse impact standard, as well as our projects under Act 248 and Act 250. This is a lot of information for communities and other things. So we do a lot of assistance to these groups. We do a lot of public meetings, workshops, outreach events to go over what are the opportunity for flood resiliency and water quality benefits. Our floodplain managers focus on the National Flood Insurance Program. So where are you getting your feet wet? They help communities look at flood insurance considerations, management needs, and mapping considerations. The National Flood Insurance Program really focuses on inundation. Where are you going to get your feet wet? So this is the Richmond Park and Ride in 2011. What I want you to really notice is in the upper corner, the Winooski River is over 1,800 feet away from the Richmond Park and Ride. It's a huge valley and floodplain, and look at the depth of the water in those cars. So it plays a key role in really helping store water and sediment, and this is going over an old rail bed, a road. So this is a lot of water moving across this very large floodplain. So we look at the inundation risk. But the National Flood Insurance maps don't cover all streams and all risks. The National Flood Insurance maps do not look at erosion hazards. They do not look at streams changing over time. The maps are static. In many of our communities, we're working with 30 or 40-year-old maps. So they do not necessarily reflect the current conditions in the watershed or recognize the need for streams to move over time. This is why the state has been working to develop river corridors. Our maps are trying to look at the need for streams to move over time. We look at the area for the stream to move. We want to make sure we're protecting current and future development from those channel adjustments, and we want to make sure we provide room for vegetative buffer for that habitat and water quality components. The state Rivers Program has been tasked with developing these river corridors for the entire state. This is up on the Natural Resource Atlas map if folks are interested to see. For all streams with a watershed size of greater than 2 square miles, the corridor will be based on the watershed size, the stream condition, the slopes will be based on that information. For streams that are less than 2 square miles, there's a 50-foot standard setback. And this is to recognize that those small streams, while most of us don't think of them adjusting too much over time, do play a significant role and are often very dynamic during a flooding event. So we really want to work with communities to recognize both types of hazards, both the inundation and the erosion hazard, because there really can be an economic and ecological benefit by providing room for those functions to happen. This is Waitsfield, by the way. So as we reach out to communities to protect our corridors and floodplain, a number of communities across the state have National Flood Insurance Protection participation, and we've had a large number of communities that are working with us to do corridor protection. So this actually map should be updated. I realize it's from October. We've probably had a handful of other communities that have since adopted river corridors that would show up. So it's a large number of communities are taking active steps to be more flood resilient, but also provide those water quality benefits by protecting those areas.
Are those just voluntary regulations?
Yes. 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 So the participation in the National Flood Insurance Program is all voluntary. It's managed by the communities themselves with assistance from our program, and the river corridors too are voluntary for the community, again with assistance from us. There's an incentive for communities to especially adopt river corridors. The Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, the ERAF fund, is applied after a declared disaster. FEMA will come in and help communities with the public assistance. So things like your roads, your bridges, your town buildings. FEMA typically picks up about 75% of those costs for those projects, leaving about 25% for the community to pick up. In Vermont, because we have that Emergency Relief Assistance Fund, the state assists with that remaining 25%. What the state has done is try to make a sliding scale for this funding source to encourage communities to take active steps. So if a community does no actions after an event, the state will pick up about 7.5% of that remaining 25% and leaving the community about 17%. The state will split the funds 50-50 with the community if they do 4 basic steps. That's working to get their current road standards, participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, have a local hazard mitigation plan, and an emergency operation plan. In order to get the most from the state looked at encouraging communities to adopt the river corridor protection areas, or they can work with the FEMA's community rating system and allow no new structures in the FEMA's hazard floodplain maps. And we have a handful of communities in Vermont that participate in the community rating system, but not as many because it's often administratively challenging for smaller communities. So more communities have been steering towards the corridor protection in order to get this higher incentive amount.
I could ask a question. A lot of the communities that are participating over the last few years were those communities that were impacted in 2011 and so have experienced flooding more recently, or has there not been a correlation?
There has both.
Okay.
So we did have some communities who had flooding, recognized the need or the interest to take strategies and worked with us to implement them right away. Other communities who have been affected by flooding historically and currently have not felt the need to move forward yet. They're still working on their basics. And then other communities who were not impacted but see the potential for financial incentive or just are a more proactive type of community have adopted. We have the Gores up in the Northeast Kingdom who have a very small population throughout their communities, really limited or no damage, but are a very proactive type of group, and so they adopted early on. So it is quite a mix. In order to help communities process all this good information, our program has been developing and working with folks to have a web page up and ready. This is our Flood Ready Vermont web page. It's a great source of information for both preparedness as well as understanding steps you can take and opportunities. Another component or section within our program is the river management program, our stream engineers. Again, they provide a lot of regulatory and technical support throughout the systems. You can really see just from the pictures on the board the mix of types of projects that they're involved in, everything from flood recovery to bank stabilization to culverts and structures, as well as habitat and fish projects. They get pulled into quite a few projects. So to really help those projects, our permitting is based on the equilibrium standard. So those projects that they work with folks on need to make sure there's no change in our width, depth, meander pattern, or longitudinal slope. So those components of that equilibrium, stream equilibrium, that really can have an effect on the channel's condition and move it into one of those channel evolution model stages. So our managers, our engineers, really help meet our goals of the TMDL and our flood resiliency by helping make sure our streams stay as much in equilibrium as possible as folks are doing projects and management on those systems. Just an example of what type of project we may see this on is oftentimes with culvert structures or structures, they have an impact on that longitudinal profile and floodplain connection. So before a structure goes in, we had a consistent energy gradient through the system. We could move sediment and water downstream easily. We had a nice cross section. It was connected up to its floodplain. And when we put the structure in, we changed our slope in the system. We changed the sediment transport. Oftentimes we see a lot of sediment built up behind a structure, and then downstream of the structure we see oftentimes scour from that system. And in part that's because when a structure goes in, if it's not the full width of the channel and it's narrower, we increase that velocity because we've changed our area. So one structure can have a significant change on the stream's equilibrium. Vermont has worked to have its standards recognized by FEMA. Going forward, those standards are now something FEMA has fully recognized as important for meeting equilibrium conditions, both for flood resiliency and water quality needs. And so when we work with communities after a flooding event, FEMA has now recognized that our standards to meet those structures are important, and they'll work with communities to put in the structure that's the right size and condition for that site. And this was really important because what we found after Irene was FEMA has best intentions, but oftentimes we had structures that were undersized being put back in the same location. And so we weren't able to meet flood resiliency needs because we're putting in a structure that had failed before, but also we weren't able to achieve our equilibrium conditions. So they have worked since Irene to really work with FEMA to get those standards recognized, and moving forward we should have positive results with FEMA as recovering from flood events. The last piece of our program, section of our program, is our Streamflow Protection. They do a lot of work with hydroelectric relicensing, people who are interested in doing small hydro, a whole mix of projects around development of hydroelectric power. And really these projects can interrupt stream equilibrium, trapping sediment, nutrients upstream, but causing degradation downstream. So they work with partners to help those projects have the minimal impact as possible. Also, our water withdrawals and our snowmaking projects can often have an impact on our stream systems. And so really helping to look at those projects to make sure they too are reduced in the amount of impacts they have over time. The Streamflow program also helps communities and partners who are interested in doing dam removal, again, reconnecting those sediment and water transport capabilities of the system. And we also help partner with our stream gauging, USGS gauging system. And this is really critical. It helps us know historically. You can see on the Dog River here, we had about 82 years of record. So it helps us understand climate change, how our systems are responding, or changes in our watershed, and really plan for flooding as well. So these gauges are really important in our state. Finally, one of the last pieces we've worked with is our education and outreach. This is done throughout all of our programs on a day-to-day basis with our field sites, with landowners, developers, etc. But we also have some very specific education and outreach tools. We've been working since Tropical Storm Irene with VTrans and partners to develop the river and road trainings. These are tiers 1 through 3. Tier 1 is a web-based activity that folks can do. Tier 2 is a 2-day training where we get folks in the classroom, around a flume, and out in the field to really understand river dynamics. And Tier 3 is really where we get into more of the engineering concepts. But we're working with road crews, municipalities, VTrans, consultants and contractors on these workshops so that on a day-to-day basis, those folks who are working in and around streams have good techniques, but also after a flood, we have folks who are more aware of what types of practices are good practices for recovery. We have 3 flumes in our program where we do education and outreach to watershed groups and regional planning commissions. And these are really great tools to get your hands wet and actually see stream processes in play. So it provides a good way for us to communicate many of the stream dynamics that aren't always easy to see. We're all bean counters. So as part of our legislative report on what our program has been up to towards meeting these goals, throughout our program, we collectively have over 2,400 projects that have been reviewed or partnered with through the lens of looking at how do we achieve stream equilibrium and meeting TMDL goals. So it's a whole mix of what activities we do and all meeting those objectives and goals. So that is the end of my presentation.
Perfect.
Perfect. All right.
We have about 5 minutes left. If
Okay.
anyone has any questions, if folks online want to type theirs in, Joanne or Eric, you guys have any more questions? No? Okay.
Not right now, I guess.
Okay. Todd looks like typing something in.
Okay. We are working with the basin planners and other folks to provide the projects into the database and help look at those reaches and information as we prioritize where projects occur and what type of project we might want to work on. So all of these components that were in our presentation also help us work with the basin planners and other partners as we're trying to achieve those goals with that work.
The rivers and roads training, that's run by you and VTrans, or really just you?
So the Rivers program is a lead for the trainings, but we partner with VTrans and Vermont Local Roads for those trainings. We're hosting at least four this year, a couple coming up in May and then a couple in October.
And who's the primary intended audience?
So the priority is to get VTrans and municipal road crews through the trainings, but we're also working with consultants and contractors, as well as the regional planning commissions and other partners who are working directly with road crews. We also recognize that there is interest from staff, so we're looking at opportunities for how we partner with staff, especially folks who might be called on after a flood to help with some of the recovery components.
While we're waiting for any online questions, I do have just a couple of announcements I wanted to share with everyone. I just wanted to mention that our brown bag for next month is scheduled May 11th, and Julie Foley from our wetlands program is going to be presenting on wetlands projects and their role in the Lake Champlain TMDL implementation. I also want to note that our ecosystem restoration grant request for proposals that was supposed to be released in early May is going to be delayed by a couple of weeks, and so that also means that our webinar that was scheduled for next Thursday, May 4th, is going to be postponed a couple of weeks. So I can send out some more details and put further details up on the grants webpage as they become available. So I guess at that point, Todd, it looks like you have a question or maybe typing something in, and feel free, you can just email Staci that question. Oh, here we go. Just a comment from Todd Minis, he's a river engineer.
Yep. It says FEMA is reviewing the 2017 general permit, Vermont codes. So again, we continue to refine with FEMA to try to make sure our standards and codes and information is collaboratively done so that they will help pay for a full the structures and the projects to meet those goals. Thank you everyone for participating. If you have questions or other things that you want to follow up on, please feel free to email me or call, and I'll touch base with you as needed. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
So one question from, yeah, thanks Joanne. Yeah, go.
That's really informative. Thanks, Staci.
Bye, Joanne.
Do you see the question from Vermont Green Mountain?
I do.
So,
so the 20% reduction of phosphorus is a goal that we hope to achieve through those multiple lenses of our program, working with achieving stream equilibrium. We know it will take a while across the system. We will work to make sure we can optimize areas where we can obtain more equilibrium, and then those areas where we're not able to, how do we make sure the streams functions as well as possible, but that we can accommodate upstream or downstream the need for those areas where we can't achieve equilibrium. So the 20% reduction will be counting as we do projects how those rivers are moved back towards that equilibrium condition. So if a stream is very incised, it will have a higher impact score as we look at the reach for the TMDL loading. If we do a project and it provides a floodplain function, then we'll reduce the impact score on that reach, and that will help us achieve a reduction in phosphorus and nutrients to the system. We typically will not be counting pounds of phosphorus, though on projects like the rail bed removal project, where we may be able to go monitor sediment and phosphorus load reduction, we could look to do that on those types of projects. But we may not do that on a project like the easement project, where we're expecting it to do adjustment over time. Does that answer your question? Thank you for the question.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Hope you can join us next month on the second Thursday for a presentation on wetlands with Julie Foley.